Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today is the 15th of February, and today we will review the past 2 days of fighting in Avdiivka, and that includes key Russian advances along logistical lines in northern Avdiivka and the capture of the Zena Air Defense base, and lastly the transfer of additional Ukrainian reinforcements to the city and its perimeter. So let's begin by looking deeper at what's going on in northern Avdiivka, starting on the 13th of February. Just as a reminder of what I talked about in my last video, it was confirmed by deep sea reporting and by other sources that the Russian forces got control of a certain section of Industrial Avenue, and so by doing so, the Russian forces were able to cut off the last paved road leading directly into Avdiivka. Now, since then, the Russian forces have not stopped their advance. In fact, they've increased the pace of their gains, and that has prevented the Ukrainians from setting up a new defensive line, let alone trying to conduct localized counterattacks in this direction. And so on the 14th of February, after consolidating their advances, the Russian forces were able to advance along this particular tree line and gain control over certain sections of the green line that you see marked on my map. And so those green lines are dirt roads or gravel roads, but those are secondary supply lines that the Ukrainians are also relying on now that they no longer have control over the yellow marked paved road. So the initial Russian advance was only about 400 meters, but due to the Ukrainians really being in disarray and unable to establish a solid defensive line, they were not able to stop the Russian advances, and by the 15th of February, they continued pressing and expanded in three directions from their original positions along this tree line. And so let's look at the south first. The Russian forces were able to advance, if you measured on the map, about 800 meters southwards. And so they were advancing along this particular dirt road, which was previously used by the Ukrainians, in order to go from Lastochkina, which is one of these key towns that the Ukrainians are using to organize their reinforcements and at least previously send supplies through towards key sectors within Avdiivka. And so as you can see, one of those paths, it makes its way directly into the residential section of Avdiivka, and then it sort of branches out southwards towards the residential section in the 9th district of Avdiivka. And so now the Russians have cut off that section, and they have actually advanced 800 meters southward along that same tree line and are getting very close to fully cutting off any sort of access that the Ukrainian forces would have, utilizing this dirt road to continue supplying their garrison in the 9th district, which we'll talk about a lot in this video because this is a part of the front line which the Ukrainians do not want to abandon yet. They do want to still continue building up their forces and protect their flanks. But as you can see, at least on the northern flank, the Russian forces are continuing to press the Ukrainians. They currently are experiencing a lot of losses due to a lot of open fields being considered in the gray zone. And in earnest, they only have one dirt road which could be used to continue supplying this district. And that is a dirt road that leads from Severne to the 9th district. And at its closest, it's only about 600, 700 meters away from the gray zone. So again, within the range of a lot of these shorter range systems that the Russians have at their disposal, not to mention all the long range systems that the Russians have continuously been using to bombard the Ukrainians as they're making their entrances and withdrawals. Now, looking at the advances made further westwards, the Russian forces are proactively thinking to the day after the Battle of Avdiivka. And that is why they've been taking advantage of their access to this road junction to advance westwards along the dirt road and set up positions that are closer and closer to Lastochkina. Because the Ukrainians, in theory, if they're looking ahead to when they eventually have to abandon Avdiivka, Lastochkina would be a logical area, at least temporarily, for the Ukrainian forces that retreat to sort of organize a defensive node and perhaps build a defensive line. Now, the issue with all these towns that you currently see on my map, like Simenivka or Livka, Lastochkina, all these villages that are being used to feed Avdiivka or once were, all of them are located on valleys that are overlooked by positions that are under Russian control or that the Russians are currently trying to take over. So that's a conversation for another time, but these defensive lines would nonetheless be tentative and very difficult to hold on to. But at the same time, you can see how the Russian forces are preparing to make the situation even more difficult for Ukrainians as they withdraw to Lastochkina by establishing firing positions in the fields directly to the east. Right now, the Russian forces are only about, if you measure it, 1.3 kilometers away from the village itself. And by doing so, they get closer to firing onto the supply routes leading from Orlivka to Lastochkina, again, further severing the connectivity of the Ukrainian garrison in this region. Additionally, the Russian forces used this tree line as cover to advance northwards. If you measure it out, you'd say it's about 700 meters northwards, and they were able to reach the road junction that connects the paved road that I was just talking about to the coke plant. So technically, for a couple of days, the Ukrainians were still able to use this paved road that leads from Orlivka into Avdiivka to send forces, in particular the 3rd Assault Brigade, and perhaps to send sort of additional supplies and ammunition to the coke plant. Now that is no longer possible because the Russian forces have physically cut off this road junction. Now, in theory, the the Ukrainians can still use the paved road and branch out at this particular point into the coke plant, or of course they could use it for a certain period of time and then go off into the open fields, and by doing so also supply it. But again, it shows how the Russians are slowly chipping away at the various means by which this coke plant can be supplied. Although when compared to the Avdiivka garrison, the coke plant is in a much better situation in relative terms, in terms of its supply situation. But in any case, the Russian forces are still advancing and slowly chipping away at the southern portions of the industrial zone of Avdiivka. And so now you see how there's this pincer being formed, the southern pincer, like around here, where the Russian forces have got control over the first business enterprises within the industrial zone. And then over here, you can see how the Russian forces have established control over the dachas near the industrial zone and along the rail line. And so by doing so, by advancing in these various directions, they have isolated a lot of formerly Ukrainian held strongholds in various business enterprises that consist of many facilities, basements, I'm sure, a lot of areas that would be resistant to the Russian firepower, like artillery. And I don't know about tunnel entrances over here. That's something that we don't have enough information about. But who knows, maybe there is some sort of tunnel connection from these business enterprises into the actual coke plant. That remains to be seen. At the same time, the Ukrainians are withdrawing from some of the peripheral areas of the industrial district and trying to concentrate as many forces as possible within the most important sections of this district. And so, for instance, these dachas just to the east of the coke plant have been turned to a gray zone. No side has full control over them. And as I said before, the business enterprises have largely been abandoned, but the coke plant itself is being reinforced with several battalions of the 3rd Assault Brigade Azov, and so their 2,000 men have recently been moved in. That was confirmed as of the 13th of February by their Telegram channel, and we know for sure that at least the 1st Mechanized Battalion of this brigade has been engaging in actual combat with the Russian forces in the southern section of the industrial zone, where for the very first time we've seen them trying to conduct defensive operations, trying to hold back the Russians with some of their Western supplied equipment that they've recently been equipped with. And so while the 3rd Assault Brigade is an offensive unit in nature, they were given defensive tasks by the Ukrainians for the time being. Nonetheless, they were pushed back from their original defensive line further north, as can be seen in this geolocated footage, which shows the Russian flag being raised at the gate, really in the entrance to Avdiivka. In the 3rd Assault Brigade's Telegram channel, they talk about having to defend against the Russian forces 360 degrees all around, basically meaning they're fighting the Russians on all sides in specific scenarios. And they talk about having to fight against 7 Russian brigades. Now, 7 Russian brigades would be equivalent to around 35,000 men. And so 35,000 to 40,000 men is likely the estimate for the amount of Russian forces that are generally across the entire Avdiivka front. So that includes certain areas of Donetsk, the flanks of Avdiivka, the rear, the logistics, artillery, and of course the forward elements. But in terms of 35,000 men fighting in the actual offensive, advancing through tree lines in various buildings, that is simply not the case. At most, the units that are conducting those attacks are doing so at company level. So when you sort of extrapolate from that, you understand that the actual offensive activity at ground zero is being done by relatively small compositions of units, and then you have a lot of rotations going on between those forces, especially on the Russian side. But if you were to say the total amount of forces you're engaging with on the entire sector is 40,000, then that is more accurate. Now, with the arrival of the 3rd Assault Brigade and potentially new units in the future, first of all, the coke plant is getting reinforcements that will hold line over there, but it also gives the Ukrainians an opportunity to send a sort of vanguard force to hold the line in certain sections where it's extremely important. That would be at least the Ukrainian hope, in order to allow Ukrainian forces that are in extremely critical areas and critical salients to get out in time. That is their thinking. And so I'm going to actually look at the areas where the Ukrainians are likely thinking about withdrawing forces, likely trying to concentrate them in a certain area like the 9th district, instead of having them spread out in all of these various small corners where they can't act as a unified body, where they're more isolated, where they're more susceptible to Russian casualties, because that is the current situation right now. They are being spread out, various Ukrainian companies, across a large area, and they're unable to coordinate their defense effectively. So this has been a major issue for the Avdiivka garrison for several weeks now, but it hasn't been addressed, and now it's more important than ever. And so if you look at eastern Avdiivka, east of the city center, there are various dachas, open fields, and forests where there are Ukrainian platoons or companies that are holding the line, and they are relatively disconnected from the main supply lines, the main logistical command and control nodes that are organizing the defense. So a lot of these units are just completely left on their own. Good luck with medical evacuations under these conditions. And their 4 defense lines, including trenches and dugouts, are just being pummeled by Russian artillery. Of course, the eastern direction over here is not being assaulted head-on by Russian infantry, but the Russians are still heavily bombarding this area with artillery and MLRS fire on a daily basis. And so as time goes on, it sort of builds up, and those fortifications get degraded significantly, and they turn from what were, at least previously, pretty well ordered and pretty significant trenches into just holes in the ground. And so there was a significant degradation in these defenses over time. The trenches got eroded, and so it became more and more difficult to hold on to those positions. And you can't really send in sappers or engineers to the ground, to ground zero, to defend and build up these trenches again, just due to the Russian firepower. You don't want to risk sending those engineers and repair an area that's going to be hit the next day anyway. And so these cacophony of factors played a role in Ukraine's decision to evacuate certain areas, as was reported by the spokesman for Ukraine's Tavria Operational Strategic Grouping, Dmitro Likhovoy. And so he said that the Ukrainians were evacuating certain positions and that they were going to what they call more favorable positions. Now, the way that he's framing it is as if the Ukrainians had a choice, when in reality they didn't, because if they were to stay in their places, then the attrition rates would just get raised significantly. So in a way, the Russians really did force their hands in this regard. And so if you zoom in and you look at the Donetsk filtration plant, this is one example of where the Ukrainians have already withdrawn. This is an area where the Ukrainians have held on for many months, so the garrison here does deserve credit, because there have been numerous Russian assaults on the flanks. There's been numerous airstrikes and drone strikes on this region, but the Ukrainians did hold on up until this very moment, and now they've withdrawn, as was reported by Deep States. And as you can see, it makes a lot of sense because they're being enveloped on 3 sides. So now it's up to the Russians to enter that area and fully clear it out. But there is still no information about the Ukrainian troops that are in these forests, in the dachas that are near the highway, or in some of these dachas that are near the body of water over here. All of the aforementioned issues that I talked about regarding the Avdiivka garrison have led to significant infantry shortages despite the reinforcements being sent in. And so the Ukrainians, as was reported by the Kiev Independent, they are saying that the Ukrainians had to take troops or just soldiers in general that were from the artillery component or from the logistics component and send them to the front line as infantrymen. And again, a lot of these men did not have and do not have the proper training. They aren't well versed in surviving on the line of contact. They don't have that sort of experience, and so a lot of them, they were really the first ones to die when facing a certain battle or onslaughts. And so that also contributed to a rise in the attrition rates, but that is a reflection of the desperate situation for this garrison. And when you also look at the troop compositions, you'll see that the Ukrainians have been relying on rifle battalions, on special purpose regiments, on various small drone groups, on national police units, on national guards units. These are not the mechanized forces that you'd expect to defend in an area like this from the regular AFU. And so now a lot of these other units that are just scattered around have been forced to pick up the pieces and defend. All of this brings us to a very important development in southern Avdiivka, and that is the capture of the Zena Air Defense base by the Russian side. And so, starting February 13th, the Russian forces really put a lot of pressure on the air defense base's northwestern flank. So, let's say the front line looks something like this, with the Ukrainians holding onto this region. And I'm being very rough with my drawings over here, but please bear with me. The Russian forces, they were pressing along this particular salient, trying to get control over the roads, the tree lines in this direction, in order to chip away at the routes, at the strip that the Ukrainians could theoretically use to withdraw their forces from the air defense base. And at the same time, there weren't frontal assaults on the air defense base, but there was a myriad of Russian strikes on those positions, which again further increased pressure on those forces to make a choice whether to stay or to leave. And so eventually the situation got so bad that the Ukrainians were only in control of 200 meters, give or take, of land, of fields that were holding on to the salient, connecting it to the wider Avdiivka garrison further north. And when you measure the gray zone included, then the Ukrainians really only had like 700 meters through which to withdraw. And so in the days around the 15th of February, the situation did reach breaking point, and the Ukrainian platoons that were defending the front line around the air defense base did make an attempt to escape. Some did, but according to Deep State, a lot of the forces were not able to make it. From my interpretation, I think they claim that at least a majority were able to make it through, but that there were still significant casualties incurred by the withdrawing forces, and that is to be completely expected, because just imagine the conditions that the Ukrainian soldiers had to endure. Look, they had to withdraw through this field over here. So what do you have for concealment, for cover? To conceal yourself, you could use tree lines in the region, you could use perhaps the artillery craters, and that's about it. You just have to run through the fields and make yourself, and just hope that you're not hit by an artillery shell or by small arms fire or any other sort of firepower the Russians have at their disposal. And they did that all the way until they reached the line of defense, the last one that the Russians have, or the Ukrainians have, before the Russians reach the 9th district. And so there's one last unified trench that runs along this dirt road, that runs along this tree line, before the Russian forces are able to reach the outskirts of the 9th district. So the Russians are only about 200, 300 meters away from the line of defense, and about 800 meters, 900 meters away from the 9th district. So the Russian plan of advancing along the flanks, putting mass pressure via firepower, and then targeting retreating forces was largely successful. And in terms of territory, they did take over the air defense base, Zenit, and the 1st Slavyansk Brigade, a DPR unit. They released their video, which was geolocated, where they raised the Russian flag in the center. And so now the Russian forces have also been able to advance as a result 2 kilometers northwards because of the Ukrainian withdrawal. And so now they are clearing out the remaining resistance of whatever small forces may remain in these dachas over here or in the various trenches that were built up by the Ukrainians. And now their eyes are also focused on the 9th district, because as you can see, the Russian forces are closing in on it, and the Russian forces would like to reach this district and take it over as soon as possible, because the faster they do that, the less urban fighting they have to experience in this region, because if they do it quickly, then the Ukrainians will have less time to withdraw all their forces from eastern Avdiivka to organize in this 9th district, and it will give them less time to mine positions, to set up firing posts. And so the Russians do want to get it over with quickly, and by doing so, they would also be able to cut off this section of Avdiivka and potentially also cut off some of the Ukrainian forces that are still stationed to the east of Avdiivka. But again, for now, we have to just wait and see what the Ukrainians have to do with their coalescing of forces in the 9th District, whether they want to hold on to the center of Avdiivka as well, whether they want to move in all of their units in this region and hold on to the 9th District alone. That remains to be seen, and the time scale also remains to be seen. So thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.